Okay, hello everyone. I hope you're all doing well. Okay, so we've been talking about strings. Okay, so in this video, let's look at some string methods, right? And basically what happens when the methods are applied to the strings, right? So I'm going to declare, okay, now the methods we're going to see today are not all the string methods, it's just some of them, right? There are so many string methods. If you go into the Java API, okay, and you look at the string class, you would see all the different methods a string object can have. We are going to look at some of them, and as we go through this whole tutorial or learn Java, we are going to see a lot more string methods. These are just some of them. We want to see what happens when they are applied to a string object, right? Okay, so let's now declare a variable, class type variable of type string. I'm going to call it again full name. That's what we had in the previous video. Full name. We've declared a variable here, right? That is going to hold a string object. It's going to hold a string object. Now I'm going to create a string object, right? Which is basically data, okay, a series of characters jumbled or joined together and surrounded by double quotations. So this is my full name. Now remember, a space is also considered as a character because that is also surrounded by double quotations, right? And so space. This is my full name. Okay. All right. So now I've created a string object, and I've basically assigned it to this variable that I have created to store a string object. Okay. And anytime I do this, basically the memory address, the location, is what it's stored in this variable, which means this variable points to the string object. We've talked about this. We talked about the fact that strings have methods, right? Methods are simply one or more lines of code wrapped up together with curly braces, okay, opening and closing curly braces, and given a name. And when that name is used, the actual term is when that name is called, the lines of code get executed, okay? And they can return data. Now, we talked about it a bit in the previous video, but let's see how it works. We've seen the length method already, right? And so we said that we try this full name. We said the dot is an access operator, right? We are accessing. Now we know this points to a string object. So in other words, you can actually. So basically, we know this variable is pointing to a string object. So what we are doing with a dot is we are accessing. It's an access operator or a dot operator, right? It's an access operator. So the name of the class type variable, the name of the variable that points to the object, the access operator, which is a dot. And we are accessing a method basically a method of this particular string object. Now, any object that is created from the string class has all the methods of the string class, has all the methods that the string class basically have, right? Or has. And so we can call one of them, and calling it means we are just using the name. So we've seen length. I'm going to have an opening parentheses and a closing parentheses and a semicolon to terminate it. Now we mentioned that any method when used this way, basically when called, has to have an opening parentheses and a closing parentheses. If there's nothing in the parentheses, that means that this method doesn't require any extra information for it to do what it has to do, for it to basically execute the lines of code stored in it. Okay, and so actually that extra information, or the extra information that is passed, okay, that we put into these parentheses, we actually call it passing information into this, that's the actual term for it. So the extra information that we pass, or the extra information that we basically type here, they're actually called arguments. And so basically this method doesn't require any arguments here, and that's why the parentheses are empty. Every method when used, okay, has to have this parentheses. If it has something here, if it has any argument here, right, that means it needs that argument, or it needs that extra information to work with. In this case, the length method doesn't need one, right? It just basically figures out how many characters, okay, are in this string object. We know this full name points to the string object, so we are saying, tell us how many characters are in what you point to, okay? And basically methods return data or return something or not, right? This length method happens to return information. Okay, what it does is It basically, now we'll look more into methods. I've mentioned this a couple of times. We'll look more into methods, but strings have methods, and it's important we have an idea of it. So this length method returns how many characters are in this in this string object. Basically, the variable, the string object that this variable points to. How many characters are in this string object? And it returns it. We are not seeing it, but think of it that way. It's actually throwing it back to us. Okay, but if we're not doing anything to it, nothing happens. Again, if we compile the program and we run it, nothing happens. But it's actually returning it to us. We are not displaying it on the screen. We are not printing it. We are not storing it in a variable. Nothing. And so that number that is returned to us, it's basically thrown away. Methods return data or not. We'll get more into methods, so don't worry. Now it happens to returning the length to us. It returns it as an integer, right? But we are not doing anything to it. So let's print it. System. I'm going to wrap a system.out.println statement around this whole method call here applied on this particular string object. Around this whole method call applied on this string object. Okay. And so since we said it's returning the number of characters, okay, stored in this full name string object, the length stored of this full name string object, since it's returning it, and because whatever is returned is in the system.out.println statement, which is also another method that takes in an argument in the parentheses and basically prints it out. In the println method, that's also a method. It was designed by the people who created the Java language. So if you're not too sure or clear about methods, don't worry. I just want you to have an idea of it. So this this println method also accepting this argument, and anytime you give it an argument, it prints it. If you give it nothing, it prints out nothing. If you give it something, it's going to print out something. Now this whole statement here, okay, basically when we use it, it's returning to us the number of characters stored in this full name string object. And because we have that return value in the system.out.println method, the job of this println method is to print whatever you give to it. We've given it this line here, which returns the number of characters of the string object. So it's going to be printed. Right, so let's compile this and then run it. All right, so you can see that it's printing 24. That means there are 24 characters in the string. If we add one more to it, let's add a letter D to it, right? Compile it and then run it. Now it says 25. I'll remove the D. So that's one method. Let's look at some other ones. But before that, we know that this returns a number of characters, right? It returns that number as an integer. So what we can end up doing is I'm going to go ahead and cut this line, declare an integer variable, and I'll call it name length, right? And I can initialize it to the whole of this and a semicolon. So basically we know this returns the length of this string object, and we are storing it in a variable that is designed to store an integer. The number of characters okay, is basically returned as a string, as an integer. So you have to make sure that the variable that you're storing it in is also an integer. Compile this, nothing happens. We can tell the system.out.println statement to print out whatever we give it. In this case, length. Okay, name length. Compile this, run, and we can see that we still see 24. Still works the same way. All right, let's look at another method. So again, we use a name of the string object, right, or the variable that points to the string object. And then the access operator, we are accessing an object. We are accessing a method of this string object. Okay, we are accessing a method of the string object, and another method of the string object. This string object is char. Some people say it differently. I'll call it in this case char at. Right? Some people say char at. I just say char at. Well, char at is fine. I'll say char at. And remember, anytime you use a method, it has opening and closing parentheses. I'm not going to type in anything in the parentheses because this method char at doesn't require any extra information for it to run. Now, what does this char at do? The char at basically returns. Okay, it gives us back. It returns. It throws back okay, or gives us as a result. We've told it to, we've basically called this method, and what happens is it returns to us the character at position. Well, I think I just mentioned that. I think I just mentioned that the char at, okay, method doesn't accept any extra information, but actually it does. Okay, it does. For some reason, I think I meant to explain that if a method doesn't have anything in the parentheses, then it doesn't require accept any extra information. Like the length method, it doesn't accept any extra information. But actually, the char at method does. Okay, it does. If you don't give it anything, you're going to get an error. So if you want to basically know how these methods work, because they weren't actually designed by us, we can also write our own methods, and we will do that when we get into methods. But if you want to see how these methods work, they are in the Java API, and we'll see them. We will see them later on in this whole series. But actually, the char at method actually takes in information, right? So we are going to pass in that information into the space, and basically that information we pass into the parentheses, they're actually called arguments. Okay, arguments or arguments, s with basically plural. All right, so let me explain what the char at does. The char at method returns the character, okay, at position. So we have to specify the position here, and so I'm going to enter position 1. So position 1 here. It returns to us the character at position 1 in the string. Now we know methods, right, basically return. Now you can write it this way without the spaces, right? I just like to have spaces in here, and it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter. It's just for clarity. So it returns to us the character at position 1 of the string. It returns it, right? And so because this whole statement is in the system.out.println statement, it's going to be printed. When I compile this and I run it, it prints T. This T. Now you'd wonder, you'd say, okay, if you're printing out the character at position 1, why is it not printing A and it's printing T? That's because strings, okay, every character in a string object, okay, has what's called an index. Okay, and that's really what I meant by position here. It has an index. Okay, it has an index. So the index, you can think of it as the position, basically. That's what I meant by position here. Every string character has an index. Starting with the first character, it has an index of not 1 but 0. That's how characters in a string are indexed, right? So every string has an index starting with the first character, which has an index of 0. Second one has an index of 1. Third has an index of 2. Fourth has an index of 4, and so on. So just remember that every string character has every string object has the characters in every string object have an index, and the first character has an index of 0, and so on and so forth. The index starts from 0, and so if you ask it for index 1, you are basically asking it for T, because this has an index of 0 and this T here has an index of 1, and that's why it returned T, right? So if I ask it for give me the character, okay, at index 0 of this full name string object, then compile this and run, now it's going to say the letter A. Okay, so it returns the character, right, as a character. It returns it as a character. Now, if we wanted to store this in a variable, I'm going to go ahead and cut it, right? And if we wanted to store this, we have to declare a character variable. Remember character variables, a char variable, like a char variable. We have to declare a char variable so we can store that value in it. So the way we declare a char variable is by using the keyword char, right? And then we give it a name, and I'm going to call it, let's say, first initial, and I can basically have the statement that I just copied, or basically cut, and a semicolon. Basically return the character at index 0, which is basically the first initial here, and store it in this variable that's designed to hold a character. Now I can go ahead and print out first initial, compile this, run, and it gives us A. Okay, so let's look at another method we can apply to the string, this string. All right, another one is basically it's called to uppercase. And so we first use the name of the string object, which is full name, and then the access operator, the dot. We are accessing one of the methods of this string object, and that method is called to, like it's the first one we're going to continue with is to uppercase. Okay, exactly this way. Now methods have opening and closing parentheses. If they have nothing in here, that means this method doesn't require any extra information. It doesn't require any arguments. The actual word for that extra information is arguments. And so we close it. Actually, the to uppercase doesn't require any arguments, and so we leave it empty. And what this method does is it basically changes this string to uppercase. All right, it changes the string to uppercase. Now, because we are printing it, right, we are going to see it. Because we are printing the string kind of changed to uppercase, we are going to see it. And so when I compile this and I run it, you can see the name has been changed to uppercase. If we wanted to store the result, basically whatever is returned in a variable, it's returned as a string over here. This whole string converted to an uppercase is returned as a string. So we would have to basically declare a string variable, right? And a string variable, I'm going to call it name in uppercase, right? And I'm going to set it equal to full name dot to uppercase semicolon. And so this is going to basically return this string, okay, converted to uppercase here. This variable has been designed to hold a string object. Now, it's because it's returned as a string. Now we know that strings are object, right? So it returns it as a string, and we know strings are object, and this variable has been designed to hold or store a string object, right? There is also the opposite of it, which is to lowercase. So I'm going to basically make a copy of this, print out that, change this to lowercase, and to lowercase also doesn't accept any parentheses. It just basically returns the string, a string of all this in lowercase. Even the A is going to change to lowercase. Everything is going to be in lowercase. Compile this. Oops, I made a mistake. Well, I made a mistake here somewhere. Oh, there isn't supposed to be a semicolon here, right? This is the end of the line, so it's only one semicolon. Okay. Compile this and then run, and we can see everything is lowercase. If you wanted to store this in a variable, I'm going to cut it. I'm going to declare another string variable. So string, and I'm going to call it name in lowercase, and I'm going to set it equal to this semicolon. So this statement here is going to return the full name, which is this string converted to lowercase. It returns it as a string, and so we are basically assigning it to this variable, this string variable, the string class type variable, which is designed to hold a string object, right? What really happens is these string variables here are storing the memory address, the location of the strings, the individual strings, and so they point to it. They have direct access to it, right? And so when we've already declared it, right? We've already seen it. We already put name in lowercase here, so it printed it. I don't think we did that. I'm sorry. Copy that and then paste it here. Name in lowercase. That's just the string object, right? Compile it, run it, and then now it prints out that. We can actually, print all of these out if we want. But this is for you to see some of the string methods and how they're used. But we will get into methods, and you will even have a deeper understanding of how methods work. And you even come back to this video and probably, most likely come back to this video, possibly, and then you'll understand it even more. Right, but I just want you to have an overview and how and anytime we apply methods to strings, you basically have an idea of what's going on, right? And so just get an overview of this, just have a feel of it, and we'll get into more details. We'll use it more and more often, and you'll understand it more. Okay, so if you have any questions, please comment down below, and I'll do everything to respond to them. Thank you very much for watching. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time with the next video. All right then. Bye-bye.